Hello, greetings. Thank you for your interest in spiritual matters, and thank you for joining us as we again explore what God makes known in Christ and also in the pages of Scripture. I'm Ethan. I work with the Venice Church of Christ. We're a non-denominational church in Los Angeles. We want to be of encouragement and service to you in any way we can in the faith. Please let us know your thoughts on what we're talking about here today in the comments. Subscribe to us. And if we can be of any further service, you can find us at VeniceChurchOfChrist.org. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and on Twitter. Today we're going to consider what the Apostle Peter wrote to the Christians of Asia Minor in chapter 3 of his first letter, beginning in verse 1. In the same way, wives, be subject to your own husbands. Then, even if some are disobedient to the word, they'll be won over without a word by the way you live when they see your pure and reverent conduct. The "in the same way" indicates that what Peter is saying to these wives is based on what has come before. We see that Peter is writing to the Christians of Asia Minor in terms of Israel in the Babylonian exile. He writes them as exiles, chosen exiles in these lands. And he encourages them regarding the great salvation that God has procured for them in Jesus, if they endure in faith, that they're now being tried with these various trials, and he explains these trials in terms of kind of a refining process. This is not evidence that God has abandoned them. He encourages them to see the value of that salvation, and because of it all, they should live holy lives, they should love one another, they should recognize the power of the Word to be built upon Jesus and to be part of the temple, which is the church, and Peter appropriates all kinds of terms used for Israel in the Torah and applies them to the Christians of Asia Minor. Beginning in 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 11, we have our more immediate context, which is extremely important for what we're talking about today. A lot of the things we're going to talk about today become very controversial in our society, and part of it comes from readings divorced from the context. Because in 1 Peter 2:11 through 17, Peter encourages Christians as sojourners and exiles to keep their conduct pure among the Gentiles. Because these non-believers, when they revile them, will have to glorify God when they have the day of visitation. These Christians are to be subject to all human institutions. They are to silence the ignorance of foolish people by doing good. And that's going to be very important for our conversation. That they are to live as free people, not using their freedom as a pretext for evil, but as God's slaves, to honor all people, to fear God, to honor the King, and to love the family of believers. He first applied this lesson to slaves who are Christians in 1 Peter 2:18 through 25, telling them that if they do good and suffer from it, from a master who, not just good masters, but also less than great masters, that this is God will give grace in these circumstances. And God will strengthen, sustain, because of the example of Jesus. And Peter has been very explicit in verses 21 through 25, that you were called to this, he says, because Jesus left you an example, that you would follow in his steps, and talked about what Jesus endured in terms of Isaiah 53 as that suffering servant, that he had done no wrong, he had done good, and yet he suffered. And he trusted himself to God, and God would justify him, God would exalt him, God would bless him, and he would have the resurrection, and all that would follow from it. And so in the same way, what is true about Christian slaves is now going to be applied to Christian wives. And they're to be subject to their own husbands. We'll be very clear about this, that this subjection is not something coerced, imposed, or forced. It is a free will decision that the Christian wife is being asked to make. And in fact, that's very controversial for the Roman world, because Peter is suggesting that women have that ability, that they are human enough, and they are conscious enough, and they have the ability to make that decision. And so that's very important. And he's imagining in this circumstance the fact that there are a lot of these women who are married to men who are still pagans, who have not also believed in Jesus. And so he wants them to do more than speak. He wants them to go out and to embody the principles of what God has accomplished in Jesus, to embody Jesus, and that's the way they're going to be best able to win over their husbands. There's a recognition here that the husband may not be the greatest husband. And even if the husband previously had been great, Roman women were expected to manage the household, honor the ancestral gods of the husband, and to be in line with the husband in many ways. For the wife to have become a Christian requires her to have abandoned the ancestral gods. And that in and of itself could have caused great consternation in the household. And of course, these kind of things would not just be known in the household, they would become known outside the household, and it may cause the husband to lose face in the community since his own household is not following after his customs and traditions. Peter recognizes that. And so what Peter is trying to do is encourage these women to glorify God in their situation by embodying faithful conduct. And by that faithful conduct, their husbands may well be won over to the word. No guarantee here, of course. And of course, when we want to look for application, we can still see that same circumstance in many situations today where there are good Christian women who came to the faith after being married and their husband has not yet become a Christian, or marry people who are not Christians. And this is still very important wisdom because you're not going to cajole, nag, overwhelm with words, a guy into the faith. You're not going to be able to browbeat him into Christianity. It's going to be something that if he will see through the actions, and that will be the most powerful testimony that will provide the opportunity to use the words necessary. And so there's some good wisdom in what Peter has to say. He continues, "Let your beauty not be external, the braiding of hair and wearing of gold jewelry or fine clothes, but the inner person of the heart, the lasting beauty of a gentle and tranquil spirit, which is precious in God's sight." Peter is now addressing the way they're dressing. There we go. When Peter does so, he has a purpose in mind. It is not a suggestion you could take to extreme that somehow suggests that any attempt at appreciating the aesthetic or enhancing the aesthetic is somehow immoral or sinful. This is not saying a woman can't have braided hair in any circumstances or wear any gold jewelry or things of that. It's an emphasis thing. The emphasis is not to be on the external, it's supposed to be on the internal qualities. It is a call to modesty in that sense. When we talk about modesty, it's not like it is today in most of our discourse, which is, putting on more clothes if you're wearing fewer clothes. Here, in the context as it is in 1 Timothy 2, is a kind of a critique of wealth in its own way. Because who can wear gold jewelry? Who has fine clothes? Who has braided hair in this time period? It's women of some means. Women who have a slave who can devote herself to doing that braiding of hair. The ability to have that kind of gold. Especially entering the assembly where you have people who may be far more impoverished, that gold that woman's wearing might be the difference between some of these guys eating or not. And it's going to lead to the kind of class division being manifest that Paul and Peter want Christians to get away from. Instead, they're supposed to go about, and they're not to cause that kind of scene. We also have to remember that in this time period, women generally stayed in the home. They're managing the home. If they were to go out, they would normally be going with their husbands somewhere. But as we've already indicated, Peter very much has in mind women who would be going at least one place without their husband. And that, of course, would be the assembly. And the moralists of the day, if there's a woman especially wearing all their best clothes and trying to look really good, the assumption is what's she going out to do? She's out to have some kind of indecent liaison. And so again, Peter's concern is work on the heart characteristics. Because if you're getting obsessed with that kind of image and you're going out, you're going to have reproach brought on the people of God. If you're going to get held up before the authorities, be held up before the authorities for something worthwhile. This kind of thing ain't it. Don't encourage this speculation that these brothers and sisters have this kind of incestuous liaison thing going on. Look at these women and how they look as they go into their meeting places and to feed the scandals. The scandals may come regardless, but Christians should not be feeding them. And that is one of Peter's contextual concern. And we can see how that concern can flow to our own day, where the disposition toward modesty, not drawing attention, not making about the aesthetic is something certainly we need to encourage faithful Christian women to consider. Also something for men to consider. This is not just something that we should say is specifically gendered, because it all is flowing from the same concept that we're not supposed to be trying to put on airs. We are to just go about our lives modestly. We're not trying to draw attention to ourselves. We're just trying to be faithful to Jesus. Just like Jesus wasn't trying to draw attention to himself in the way that he lived his life. Peter continues, "For in the same way, the holy women who hoped in God long ago adorned themselves by being subject to their husbands, like Sarah who obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. You become her children when you do what is good and have no fear in doing so." Peter's choice of Sarah to talk about this, the idea that when you do these things, you are making yourself part of the tradition of how God's people and the women in God's people have done this for generations. Interesting to go back to Sarah, because in a lot of ways when you read the Genesis account, sometimes you wonder about Sarah. Sarah's the one who says, hey, you can take Hagar. Sarah's the one who's like, oh, I can't stand Hagar. What does Peter have in mind? Well, he's quoting specifically Genesis 18 and verse 12, where Sarah's laughing to herself, am I going to be able to bear a son when my Lord is old and worn out, and I'm worn out with pleasure? Which is kind of a very thing to say, right? And it's in fact kind of somewhat doubting what God promised he was going to do. What he also probably has in mind the whole narrative. Remember, Sarah's the one who follows Abraham. Sarah leaves her whole family, everything she's ever known, because her husband heard a voice telling her to go somewhere. If somebody came to you and said that, yeah, we need to go here because I heard a voice telling me, and I think it's God telling me to go do this, you might think that person needs some help. And not only that, of course, there's the two incidences in Egypt and before Abimelech where Abraham has Sarah say that she is his sister, not his wife. And there's that less than truthful thing going on that Sarah perpetuates, even though it's going to maybe cost her something and gets her into these circumstances. Maybe Peter has something like that in view. And of course, that's just going to open a lot of questions up. But the idea, we suddenly get the idea that there's this pattern of behavior that the women should consider, and that they will be children of Sarah. They will be, which would be important since, of course, they're trying to all be children of Abraham, right? To be a daughter of Sarah and a man to be like a son of Abraham, these are the families of promise. This is where the whole promise comes through, and Jesus being the ultimate embodiment of that promise, leading to the hope of resurrection. And then we have verse 7. Husbands, in the same way, treat your wives with consideration as the weaker partners and show them honor as fellow heirs of the grace of life. In this way, nothing will hinder your prayers. So we've seen that Peter has addressed Christian slaves, then he addresses Christian wives, and now he addresses Christian husbands. And when we see the word wives here, the word here is a little different than the word you got in Ephesians and other relevant passages. And we can understand it as not just including the wife, but also any other women in the household, which would include daughters, it would include female servants, so on and so forth. And they're supposed to treat them with an understanding way, the NET, with consideration. As the weaker partners, show them honor as fellow heirs of the grace of life. Whatever we want to say about weaker partner must be squared with the fact they are to have honor as fellow heirs of the grace of life. And we need to be careful, because a lot of people have taken the weaker vessel, weaker partners thing, and gone in all kinds of directions. And most of those directions end up being a baptism of social constructs, of what is imagined to be the difference between men and women, that ends up trying to suggest that men are superior to women in various ways. What does Peter have in mind? Peter likely has in mind physical strength, because one of the things that just is a biological reality is, in general, men are stronger than women. Is it true that there are some women stronger than some men? Certainly. But when you start comparing like with like when it comes to men and women, the men will be a little bit stronger, a little bit faster, etc., 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 in the way that this has worked. That's just kind of the way the biology has worked. And of course, there's also a social commentary here, that the women are certainly weaker in social standing. That is absolutely true in the Greco-Roman world. Still even true today, despite the fact that we are moving toward a much more egalitarian construct in our society. There's still many aspects in which women have many more challenges in life, in society, than men do. And so notice that husbands are to treat them with consideration. This consideration is not to the end of, condescending to the little woman or being patronizing toward the woman, but instead to support, to encourage, and we dare say even to advocate for, to be the one who, because they've got the stronger position, to use that strength to serve. Again, going back to the fact that we do not use our freedom as a pretext for evil, but as God's slaves. As a Christian husband or head of household, we are not to use our freedom for a pretext for evil, but as God's slaves, to serve God. And we serve God when we're serving and seeing ourselves in that role of a servant. So Peter makes that connection, and of course the whole idea is based on what Christ did. Just like Paul does in Ephesians 5, in verse 21, the whole framing of his discussion there of men and women in terms of Christ in the church comes with to be subject, each one of you, all of us, subjecting to one another in the fear of Jesus. And of course Matthew 20, where Jesus himself talks about the fact that in Christ we're not to be about power games. And so it's not to be a power trip. Instead, it's to show them honor as fellow heirs of the grace of life. Again, a powerful demonstration that the women are equal in the sight of God with men. Men made man and woman. God added man and woman in his image. That they are of equal value and dignity. And that the men need to do this with this warning, that if you don't, your prayers will be hindered. Peter here is not countenancing any kind of abuse. He is not countenancing any kind of situation in which men are being abusive or patronizing or in any way, shape, or form presuming themselves to be superior to women. Instead, he is encouraging them to use the gifts God has given them to serve the women in their household, to uphold their value and dignity, and to look at it in terms of joint heirs of the grace of life, to see it on a fundamental equality, not in terms of I am better or greater than you, and because otherwise their prayers will be hindered, because God's not going to listen to prayers of the people who do not value women the way that he values women. And that's something that a lot of guys need to think really hard and fast about, is if indeed we are valuing the women in our lives the way that God values them. And so we see here what Peter is doing. Peter is talking to these people who are part of a minority group that is tolerated at best, persecuted at worst. Everybody's looking at them with suspicion. And therefore he wants them to keep their conduct in such a way that when there's going to be all these accusations, they're going to be for good reasons. He doesn't want there to be the hindrance of the witness because of hypocrisy or ways that are contrary to the ways of Jesus. And so that is why he has encouraged Christian men and women to behave in the ways that he has. And we do well to consider them and find ways for husbands and wives to practice these things in their relationships to glorify God in love, humility, and service. We're again so thankful that you've joined us. If you have any questions or anything that we've talked about here with 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 1 through 7, or if anything else, please let us know in the comments or reach out to us at adventurechurchofchrist.org. May the Lord bless and keep you until we're able to meet again.